Good afternoon, Europe. Good evening, Southern Hemisphere, and good morning, America. Welcome to Radio Week, sponsored by Red Tech. I'm Jay Tyler, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending from around the world. I believe we've got an excellent program for you today, talking about radio facilities. We've gathered some of the best guys in the industry, some integrators that have built facilities all over the world, and we're going to introduce them in a minute and talk about building radio facilities, whether it's building a brand new plant from the ground up, maybe you're upgrading an existing space, maybe you're actually going to be doing a full rebuild in place. So what we've done is we've gathered Chris Penny from Agile in Australia. We've gathered Marcus Becker from Southern Broadcast in New Zealand, and Mike Doris from Inrush in Chicago. Some of the things we're going to talk about today, highlight on, are planning for radio facilities, budgeting for these facilities, picking the right space for you, leveraging technology, local and remote or hybrid operations, sort of what we did during COVID, and visual radio. So as I mentioned, we've got our four experts. And one of the first things we have to do when we're planning for any type of new project is come up with a budget, come up with a scope of work. This is probably one of the most important things we do. And we also need to establish a chain of command and how everybody's going to work together. So the first question I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Chris about this. But before, I forgot to mention, we will not have a Q&A at the end. So I encourage our viewers, as questions come up, please email us. You can chat with us, or you can do it anonymously if you like. But as we're discussing each of these topics, if questions arise, please send them over to us. So Chris, talk about the beginning of a project. When a customer comes to you, whether they want to do a studio project or a rack room, where's the first place that you start?
It's a few things, because of course, Jay, look, it starts with an idea. Someone has a concept, someone has a plan to move, someone has a plan for something new and big they want to do. But typically you're in a business. So I guess some of the first questions we ask are, how does the space and the technical design align with your plans? And can we adjust that to make it work in the short and medium term, that 5 to 10 year business plan? And things that you want to consider are like, do you have a room to expand? That, you know, in your sort of 3 to 4 years, things are getting bigger. You've got extra space to do a bit more stuff with the groundwork already done to launch off that launch pad. Have you got room to take on more staff? And what's the total cost of ownership of what your ambitions are? So it goes to facilities, it goes to upkeep, it goes to technology as well, because of course technology is really difficult to keep up with unless you've got the right backing from your suppliers. And typically the question there is, do you rent as software as a service, for example, or do you buy the technology? And I guess some of those decisions are going to be driven by whether your business works in OPEX or CAPEX. So you may want to rent it, you may want to buy the systems that you're running in that respect. Some of the questions you want to ask is, how do the upgrades work? So it's probably really important to understand, as you're going along your journey, if I need to upgrade something, are you going to have a big cost? Have you got a support contract there? And this is how you keep current and relevant to what's going on. So having all those ideas in mind, just where you're starting from and where you're going to, might help you formulate a budget. So how much money you have got set aside to put into this project. And it's a budget to start with, and then it's an OPEX budget to keep that running over time. The other thing is buy-in from all parties. It's really important to have everyone in your organisation and every, stakeholder having an investment and an excitement about what you're trying to do, because that's going to see a great benefit in the buy-in that you have with people gets people excited, and they're really willing to help you instead of being standoffish. So the more quickly you can organise to get people involved in your project, in your idea, and on the same side, it gets them on side and gets this groundswell happening around the project. And that's one of the probably key formulas for success.
I have a question. So we have different types of we have news talk, we have music, community stations. Everybody watching today is probably from one of those genres. Would you say everything you just mentioned applies to all of those types of format? I mean, is there any difference when you're looking at what type of product these customers are putting out there?
I don't think so, only because there's a cost to everything you want to do. I think the business needs to see an outcome, and people have got to be invested in it for it to be successful. So I think, to come up with a budget to seed your idea with all the key stakeholders, and those stakeholders aren't. I mean, I'm used to talking to engineers, being a systems engineer in a business that deals with that, but I think when you're an engineer, that's not always the best skill set to have to run a project. So when you're running the projects and doing things, to get external help and to have people in the business who can talk up and down the verticals of your business is probably really helpful too.
Yeah, we're a trend that I think. Well, you guys are all integrators, and one of the things that we're seeing now, especially in America in the major markets, it's not so much building a radio station anymore. It's actually integrating several pieces of the puzzle, and it's the automation system, it's the console routing system, it's the telephone system, it's the visual radio system. And as you mentioned, that's a lot of different expertise, and it's going to be hard for any one engineer or even a couple engineers at a station to possess all of those talents to pull those together. And in Europe, we've seen integration. The majority of our customers in Europe, they all do their own installs. Down in India, I think it's 50-50. A lot of the people may have had somebody come in and they're maintaining them now. We're seeing a big shift now from the traditional radio property as well. So not only do we have this, management between, or I guess this communication between the accounting department, the general management, and the engineering, and then the external contractors, we've seen it's a large thing to take on. And so that's why I think that you integrators do a very good job doing that. And part of it is you guys have expertise in all of those areas. One of the, and if anybody has any questions as we're going on, there's a comments tab that you can type into too and ask us about any of those. As we were talking, we've seen these big projects coming out, and Mike Doris from Inrush in the United States has, in the past few years, has built a few hundred radio studios. And what we've seen is radio studios, TV studios shifting from those traditional robust facilities with floating floors, double paneled walls, special acoustic tiles in the ceiling. And so one of the things that we've seen is people now going from a traditional dedicated broadcast facility, maybe into an office space or just a space that wasn't designed for broadcast. Mike, is a guy that's been doing these installs and coming from the old school where we had these perfect studios, soundproof doors, into these office spaces that weren't designed for broadcast. How would you say that's affecting the industry, or how is that? How does that apply to your job? Is it easier? Is it less work? What does the final product? What is it like?
It's a mixed bag. I think that the biggest reason that a lot of people are doing that is because it is a huge cost saver. It is very expensive to build rooms that are very well isolated from the outside, from other adjacent rooms, and so on. The construction takes longer to build out something to that extent. Sometimes you're trying to source much harder to find materials. You can't use things that are just as readily available off the shelf. If you're trying to build something like a old school facility. So it's a lot faster, it's cheaper to knock them out that way. And for the most part on the technicals, Chris and Marcus may disagree with me, but you can get away with more based on mic processing techniques that have improved. A lot of facilities that were built out with, very well built facilities, almost like recording studios, you'd have mics with basically a preamp and nothing else. So you really needed to make sure that things were very well isolated. If you have something with modern mic processing, you can cheat quite a bit. So it makes the projects go faster. There's less time spent on some of those details. The biggest issue in the long run becomes honestly complaints from staff, because when you've done that, a lot of staff, if they're of any kind of older generation, they're used to having been in facilities where they can crank the speakers and they don't disturb the person in the next room and they don't hear anything pass by in the hallway and so on. And now all of a sudden they can. And it creates a very negative perception pretty much immediately because they think it's crappier, regardless of whether it actually impacts the product. So, I think a lot of it can be things that, we can shave down some of the walls and we can not necessarily worry about the door to the same extent. And the final product may not be directly impacted, but management and engineering will hear about it. And that's never fun to hear that people think that your facility has been built that much more poorly than the last one. But that's what has happened.
How big of a savings do you think it is, though? I mean, what does a traditional broadcast studio door cost?
So I mean, it's quite the curve. So if you're looking at something that's going to be like a STC rating in the 50s and 60s, you're talking about something that's going to be 5-6 times the cost of what a standard office door is. If you have an office door that's going to be down in the mid to high 30s, you're talking about usually about a quarter of the cost of that. So it is a substantial savings to avoid that type of higher grade door.
Okay. Marcus, down in New Zealand in the Southern Hemisphere, you've done projects for the national radio, private radio. We did a big install down in Christchurch for the folks at MediaWorks. You've also done a lot of community stations. How are you seeing the thing about construction, old school versus new school? And what are the pros and cons that you're seeing in the field?
Oh, look, I mean, Mike pretty much summed it up. I mean, it's always going to be very, very tempting for the accountants and for radio station management to look at the cost of real estate and look at the cost of building studios within that, how it affects their leases. And we've got a situation here recently where one of the larger builds we did recently was in a heritage building. So it wouldn't have really mattered how much they wanted to make it perfect. They would have still struggled because there were constraints around what construction they could put into it. But it is changing. I think it depends a lot on the size of the radio station to a degree. But as Mike said, the technology has come a long way. And what once was a perfect environment, and the term recording studio was used, is quite accurate. You could detonate guns outside and you wouldn't hear it inside. But now it's like the choice is really how much of that is ever going to get to air. And with the technology and mic processing, with the gates and things that you have in it, downward expanding, so on and so forth, it's really not that big a deal anymore. But I think you still do have that shift. I mean, obviously, if you're building massive amounts of studios, the price is going to, they're going to try and drive the price down given the size of the overall project. I'm thinking about your client there in the States. But say, for example, the last big build we did, there was money to do a decent job. Whereas the little community stations, they scrape together money where they can get it from. They'd like to have the really good tech. And how can we get by is what's good enough. It's quite funny, the last bigger station we did for a sports talk network, there was a lot of effort in this heritage building put into soundproofing, floating floors and packing foam underneath it, and lots of beautiful polished floors everywhere around the studio. And of course, when we were building the whole thing, we thought we did quite well. Until the salespeople started coming in and the high-heeled shoes outside the studio. Honestly, they do horse racing commentaries on this radio station. You would have thought that was continuous based on the salespeople walking by and their winkle pickers and so forth. But again, what's good enough? A roll of carpet, thin strip down that hallway, problem solved.
Chris, you did this massive project for the largest sports network in Australia, right in Melbourne. That was an office building, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they were built quite cost effectively because I guess it's interesting when you talk about soundproofing. A lot of people new to the game say, oh, well, it's just, foam things on walls. And there's probably two things about it. There's sound isolation where, like Marcus said, where you've got people walking up and down the hallway, or like Mike said, when you've got people turning up the volume, you don't want to hear it from the next room. But there's also the acoustics of the room, how you sound. And, I'm just here at home and I might not sound wonderful because I'm in this room, but you walk into these studios and you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get these beautiful walls put up with all these things to make it sound so nice and great for your sound. And the first thing they do is get TV brackets and put reflective TV surfaces all around the wall so they can get their backdrop in. So it's funny how the money used to get spent on all these things, and now even if you spend the money, you've got different perspectives on what that room needs to do now. And sometimes the microphone's the last thing people think about, and that really comes into the art of microphone choice. So you might choose a different microphone, you might choose different mic placement and all those sort of things. So there's a bit of art, and I think that's trial, error and experience that will get you there in those sort of tricky environments.
Yeah, no.
The place Croc Media was exactly like that in Melbourne. We had some tricky studios, and they were tight spaces because they had a certain floor plate. And yeah, I think we did some really, really nice stuff with mic processing, mic placement, and walls that weren't parallel as well. So there's some really simple things you can do from the get-go.
Well, Chris, of course, the sports station I was just referring to was a subsidiary of the one that you built there in Melbourne, and exactly the same thing happened. There was some design aspects put in there to keep reflective surfaces down with windows and angle the windows and do everything right, and then hang a million big screen TVs around for all the branding and everything, and then all of a sudden it was a bit lively in there. So microphone choice was a big thing at that point.
Part of this consolidation is what we're seeing. We know there's less technical people in every single country in the world. It seems like broadcast is something that we are losing more engineers than gaining. Would you guys agree?
Mm-hmm.
Chris mentioned earlier about the art of microphone placement. Yeah, and he mentioned the word experience. That's something that is being lost. And, like I said, in Europe, 80% of the customers have somebody else install their systems. I think Australia too, you've got a lot. In the US, it's probably 50-50. But what we're seeing more of a trend of, and I am certainly, is more and more systems integration. And I want to get back to the construction phase a little bit with Mike, because he's been doing so much of this. And, I used one example of studio doors because everybody knows they're expensive and it's a must on every single studio. Mike, when you decide, and Chris, you might touch on this after Mike. So when you did, I'm going to say, iHeart New York City, it's a big project. A lot of those studios, they have some custom studios, but there's like 40 studios. What percentage of them are exactly the same?
About 50% of them are all the exact same type of smaller 2-position studio. And then there's a total of 7 types of studios there for all 40. So if you want to do some quick math, most of them end up being this 2-position type. There's a few smaller ones that are single position, a few really big ones, but the majority are very, very similar studios.
And when we're talking similar, we're talking lights, furniture, chairs, HVAC,
Correct.
Automation, console routing, telephony.
Yeah. We built them assembly line style of, there's 2 long hallways that have the same exact equipment, same exact mic, same exact furniture, the whole thing. And it'd be tell one guy put all the screws in and put in all the brackets for all the zip ties in this one, and just go down the row and do the whole thing. Take the next cable harness, put that same one in across all the same rooms. So very, very similar, and that also cuts down on time to build because there's no thinking. The thinking's been done and has been done before, and it can be good and bad because the good part is the time to build it decreases substantially. The bad is that then in that particular market, there's talent that says, well, I wanted it over here and I needed this slightly different thing. And now you have to contend with that. The time to build it, the cost to build it all comes down substantially. There end up being potentially some other problems if you do that. If you do that too far, you know?
The big companies figured this out. And I don't want to say McDonald's, but if you go into McDonald's, everything's in the same space.
Right.
A lot of the banks, any large franchises have realized that the fastest way to completing projects or expanding is to use sort of this cookie cutter approach. Marcus and Chris, do you guys see the same thing in your country?
Where there's smart people, yeah. I think because you also get the advantage of being able to support a system where you've got a system that's the same in a facility with 40 studios. You learn one studio and can support them all. Same for your operators, because potentially your operators aren't technical people. They're just people who know how to produce a product. So the more you can teach a person, well, this is the technology we use and this is how you use it, and it's a one-off thing, and whichever space you move into, there's some great advantages.
And the thing is, with the technology that's available now, with the digital stuff, I mean, that by its very nature tends to give you that as almost like a consequence. You know, the reality is that there is one way these things work, and whilst they're infinitely configurable, you know, if you know the back end of your digital system, and it's not just Wheatstone, it could be Axia, it could be SAS, it could be whatever. If you know the back end of how these things work, you're going to work out pretty fast how that thing's gone together. I mean, yes, you know, you can do some really tricky stuff like you've done, Chris, and that'll be a head scratch for a lot of people. But the base working of how these systems work is going to be a lot easier to you know, support in the digital realm than it ever was in the analog, I think.
But the philosophies are the same, Marcus. I mean, yeah, I've done some stuff. I've done some big facilities. I think, Jay, we could talk about a facility that had 100 and something odd studios over 2 levels where it was, you know, the cookie cutter approach made that project work, and where we could deploy that quickly in the time the client needed was all because we duplicated everything. We kept, you know, inputs on systems the same. So from one studio to the other, the CD player is always plugged into the same holes, and just everything like that. Anything that you can make the same for everyone just makes that learning curve so much easier, even if it does get a little bit complicated.
Yeah, and Chris, the project you're talking about is actually not a traditional broadcast facility. It's the LDS Church. You know,
it is.
Yeah, and they do a world broadcast twice a year, where they literally broadcast over to 100 countries, and they have an indigenous human sitting in every single one of these booths doing a live translation, which then hits a satellite uplink in Salt Lake City and then is distributed around the world live. And Chris built that. And he also built a really good monitoring screen for all of that, because you think about the footprint of 100 studios. I don't know how big the screen is, but they have a massive screen. And we're going to get to this because it's also about centralized support. So at LDS, they can look at one screen builder screen and see the status of every metering and the actually control of every single one of those studios from a centralized place.
Yep.
And, you know, it was just a matter of time before the rest of the studio stuff caught up with, in my career of 28 years here, the automation system. Automation system was the first thing that I saw radio groups standardize on. You know, back when we started, at least in America, you know, maybe there was 11,000 radio stations and about 8,000 owners. Then when consolidation came, I think we now have about 14,000 radio stations and 3,000 owners. But we saw that once somebody really embraced the automation system, back then it was RCS or Audio Vault or BSI. Once there was somebody that embraced that the automation system or a company, they standardized on that. They standardized on that for cost, savings, technical ability, and also, as Chris mentioned, the talent. Anybody could walk into any on-air room. Now we're seeing that more now towards everything from generators to traffic and billing to telephony systems to console routing systems. As integrators, and I guess I'll ask Mike first, when you were doing a project like the one we did in New York City, where you had the same mic processors, the same video switchers, the same monitors, again, that's a massive savings for you in the technical install.
Yeah. I mean, knowing that it's the same equipment, and in that particular case, it's more so that it's, that whole company has shifted to that same set of equipment. So on the technical side, they can centralize what they have as far as support for a bunch of different markets. They're centralized. There's a cost savings in the fact that they've sorted out a deal in that sense. There's cost savings on, there's a lot of different advantages to that. And on top of that, they, like other national broadcasters that are doing the same thing, have talent that, especially along the East Coast, can literally go from one market to another, walk into a studio that is identical, and do another shift for another station. And there's no difference. There's no learning curve. It's that same talent can go from one city to another and walk into the same space and do a shift for another station. So yeah, definitely lots of advantages to combining on equipment and standardizing kind of across the board on the technicals. Because something you mentioned earlier that I think is worth doubling down on is that standardization. When I mentioned having things kind of custom for this room versus that room, I think that for the most part, it is kind of irrelevant to the talent. In many cases, let's say 90% of cases, it doesn't really matter if the mic is placed on one side or the other side, or if the console's Axia or Wheatstone or whatever. All of that's kind of irrelevant to the product. You'll always have talent that's going to want to have something, specialized or bespoke or whatever, but most of the time it's irrelevant. So that standardization can be a savings on the technical side, on the technical ability side, on the support side, without really impacting talent if you do it right, if you train the talent correctly, and so
on. Along with standardization, I use the McDonald's approach, and I don't want to diminish radio, but I will say that we've caught on. And my first visit to a radio station was in Syracuse, New York, when I was in second grade. It was Y94 FM, located in downtown Syracuse, as part of a field trip. I walked into that studio, and I remember seeing stickers everywhere, banners, Y94 FM painted everywhere. And I think all of us remember this. And I think 5 years ago, I was down in India, and I remember walking into the Radio Murchie studios, seeing the same thing. We got the little hot peppers all over. Everything's branded, with the yellow and the little chili peppers everywhere. At least in the US, and I think, Chris, I saw this down in Australia too. Part of standardization is actually making these studios be multifunction. I always say, instead of building radio studios these days, we used to have on-air rooms, dedicated on-air room for every radio station. They'd have dedicated production room. They might have a voice booth. But now part of standardization is we're building these radio studios, and I say like we're building kitchens, because the way that you guys are building these now, it could be a breakfast joint in the morning, it could be a tapas place for lunch, it could be a steakhouse at night, we could move the chairs out, and it could be a dance club. And what I think what allows this is these people doing digital branding. Would you guys say the same, like Mike, what you're doing for some of these big groups? Everything is dynamic. I don't see any stickers. I don't see any signs. I don't see anything that designates this studio anymore for this particular show or this particular brand.
Sorry,
was that me or Chris?
I'll go with you, Mike, because you've been doing it lately and breaking a lot of monitors.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the move. And it really does kind of factor into this. This studio can be the prod room for this station at this day part, and can be, the air studio for afternoon drive for another station. And so part of that is, if the branding can be shifted digitally, then you don't need to worry about that if you're trying to include that in any kind of either visual radio or just for basic photos, or some band comes into town, you want to make sure the branding's right. So yeah, that's definitely something that a lot of broadcasters are shifting to. It creates situations where there's a broadcaster in Chicago who moved actually a few years ago, and this is the first facility that I saw that did this, where they have 5 stations, 5 signals, and they only built 3 studios. Period. Like no prod rooms, no nothing. They have 3 studios. The spreadsheet to schedule this, because also this was 7 or 8 years ago. So they still had a substantial amount of live shifts. So the spreadsheet that they had to come up with in programming of how to fit all of these things and who was in what studio at what time was pretty intense. But it was very impressive. I mean, that they went from a facility that had 12 studios to 3 without really any disruption. And so the main signal had one studio for morning drive and afternoons. The prod guy was in there in between. And why they did, I mean, I think it was just really for cost savings because it seemed a little intense. But it was really kind of a precursor for what pretty much everyone else has done since. So yeah, that the branding becomes the last piece of, if you have not digitized that, you kind of miss the boat. So making sure that last part, if you get over that last hump, then, you can make all of those rooms versatile. And, kind of like Marcus was saying earlier, the technicals behind it, when you move to an AOIP platform, make all of that switching just infinitely easier. I mean, it would be a nightmare to try to do that kind of switching if it was with analog cabling and analog switchers. Like, you could do it, but oh my God. So once you move to an AOIP platform, it's like, yeah, I can move whatever I need to, wherever I need to. And it's not a big deal on that side. Now you just need to make the artwork change on the wall. So
it's a philosophy thing, should the programming dictate the engineering, or should the engineering dictate the programming? And I think the answer is probably that the programming should be dictating what the technology should be doing. So to be able to put the power of that into people's hands and press a button, and then the branding changes and the room just works the way they need it to without doing anything, that's a great thing for the business. Sorry, Marcus.
And with modern technology, I've often said to people, especially with this new digital stuff and the AIP, the answer is almost always yes. Now, what's the question?
Gentlemen, we've got our first question. It's not so much right on this topic I want to come back to, but Bala has a great question here, and I'll answer it, then all of us can chime in. He says, as virtual interfaces become increasingly prevalent in radio studio workflows over the past decade, do you anticipate that the physical radio console will remain the core of the radio studio? That is a great question, and one of my favorite stories about that is in 1998, Frank McCoy, who ran Capstar, was sitting next to me at NAB in the coffee line, and he looked at me and was like, "You're the console guy." And I was like, "Yes, sir." And he said, someday it's going to be a big touch screen and there won't be any consoles, there won't be any knobs or faders anymore. And he was the guy that always wore a bow tie, I remember. Very respected engineer here in the States. And I laughed at him and I was like, "Yep, sir. Eventually that will be the case." But as long as we have traditional radio operators that learned on a console that want to touch a knob and spin something, fast forward to 20 years later, 2018, we started selling a lot of soft consoles. People still need some type of level control. I think as the younger generation that has never turned a knob or moved a fader but has swiped and done stuff on a phone, I think they will adapt to that. Chris Penny actually taught me this, that you did, that in today's world with professional equipment, what all these systems are simply mixing routers. And if everything is calibrated and brought in correctly, about the only thing you need faders for are anything remote, telephone callers or remotes with variable controls. Do you guys agree with that?
Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. And I'm probably, there's varied opinions on it.
You taught him that.
You taught me that. You're the one who said that.
Come on.
All of our recording studios have on-off buttons. So many engineers say the board op just needs to walk in and have one big button that turns it on and one big button that turns it off.
So I work at sports broadcasters who operate the thing. They play it like a piano. It's the most amazing. If you could ever get the opportunity to watch a racing horse, goat, chicken racing broadcaster, that they do all these things, and they're basically doing an OB every 3.5 minutes. And these guys are playing this thing like the piano. They've got more stuff on preview than they have going to air, and they just unbelievable. They're watching stats on screens, and that's an art form to itself. And they need faders, they need tactile control because they're not watching. And yeah, for that, absolutely. The other end of the spectrum is I just voice track in a studio. Well, you can get away without a console at all, and you can take the screen away. Really, if you're just voice tracking, you can do all your fades on screen. Obviously, rely on the great technology that you have to bring all the signals in and get it right, like you said. But and in the middle there's I think still a lot of people who feel they're not driving the bus without the steering wheel in front of them.
Okay.
So there you go. I gave you a not direct answer.
Yep. Now, Marcus, how much glass stuff have you sold down there or installed?
Oh, very little, for exactly the reason that Chris said. And just before I go on, can I just give a big shout out and a hi to Bala? Bala is a friend from years and years back there in Kuala Lumpur. Great to see you here, mate. It's been a while. We should catch up soon. Next trade show. But as Chris said, I mean, especially when you're dealing with these bigger studios, these guys and girls are working a lot tactile. It's the space in front of them, and they really, they're doing stuff on this board that is, as he said, accurately. It's like them playing a piano, and they simply don't get that from a touchscreen. But touchscreen's got cost advantages. It's got maintenance advantages. It's compact. You can integrate it nicely into furniture. There are applications for both. So if you're running a voice track studio or a real, light usage music studio, yeah, sure, put touchscreens in there but I think coming back to Bala's question, how much is this console, whether it be touchscreen, virtual, old school, whatever, how much is that going to be present in studios of the future? Well, look, we've seen a few people in recent times trying to make various attempts at redesigning the concept for a radio studio, and to a certain extent, I'd say it hasn't worked a lot. You've still got a console, whether it's slidey faders, push buttons, or virtual. People running a radio show, they're going to want a console. There was something shown recently where it was like a office desk, and I think that's probably a little bit of a step too far. Takes away a lot of the magic of radio, and there's a lot of unfamiliarity to it. So I think no matter what the technology does, we're still circling around the same concept, whether it be glass, whether it be faders.
That's good news for me because I make consoles. And there's a case where I agree with you, Marcus. Michael, you did a big project, and Michael did a big project in New York where the broadcaster traditionally had physical consoles. And Michael, you deployed how many? 25?
It's 27 glass LXEs, but it's 27 glass LXEs and the rest is physical for the same reason that Chris and Marcus and you all already hit on, which is all you have to do is you go watch one of the morning shows, and for any of these board ops, they're not looking at anything. They're just using their hands. They know where everything is, and they, when they move, they had to kind of relearn that, but they relearned that in a matter of an hour of where everything was and how and what it felt like and what position it was. So until touchscreens suddenly have that kind of level of tactile response and also somehow have raised edges to figure out where things are, maybe we'll just have built a console at that point. I'm not really sure if that was all a touchscreen, but yeah, I mean, it's still definitely a combination of those things. If you don't need to look at if you need to be able to not look at it, you pretty much still need a physical console. But prod rooms, lightweight music stations, sure, you can make that a glass screen and move on. So
yeah. So I hope that answers your question. It's a 50-50 mix. As you said, no matter what, if you want to operate with a touchscreen, you're going to have to look. You just can't do it by feel. Naveen has a good question here. Chris, you can see this question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we read it because we're going to actually talk about this in a minute. So the question go ahead, Chris.
Sorry. Yeah, so how does the innovations impact the remote broadcast units? Is the OB vehicle dead? And what are the new designs and thinking for remote outside broadcasts? I think more than anything, it seems that bandwidth is killed the OB truck. I think where you can now get bandwidth where you used to use STLs or used to need a rack of equipment to encode over compressed links and you needed to produce at the venue. I see a lot of people bringing back raw feeds straight across high bandwidth links and mixing them in their studios, in their proper production environments, and not taking those things out on the road. I mean, that's the extreme view, and that's where I see things. You don't have to fly operators around. You don't have to do anything. You just liven up a high bandwidth data link at your ground and get a low, just a guy who can plug a microphone in and put it in the right spot, and keep your expensive operator in the nice soft room with his fridge and his coffee mixing all the games or whatever it might be. That's what I see, and that's at the extremes. That's on the edges. Marcus, what do you see?
Oh, listen, we see this all the time, and one of the extensions to this is, and I think Jay, you might want to talk about this in a second in relation to the pandemic and the remote operation, but this is kind of linked. We got a little radio station in one of the sort of neighbouring towns on the Coromandel Peninsula here in the North Island, and we built them an old. It's called a Zephyr caravan, right? So it's an old 1960s single axle caravan, and we tricked it out with some stuff on the inside, and it's got a Air4 console in it, and it's got some tie-line codecs, and it's got a 4G modem, and it uses forward error correction, and they've only just recently popped Starlink in there as a possibility as well. And this isn't just sending back clean feeds, so these guys have got a remote access into a Wheatstone screen builder switcher that can liven the source to air. They can go. This has got solar power and it's got batteries in it. They can go anywhere they want. And this is an extreme for the outside broadcast, really, because the idea of sending back full program isn't done that much anymore. But these guys do over 4G, and with the technology available and the error correction and the integration and the way it ties into remotely controlled studios. They can rock up to a location, fire up this 4G signal. They can send high quality stereo audio right back to the studio and run full shows from it. And obviously to the smaller extent, we're doing it on these things now. You can get high quality voice grade filed straight back in through this tech, and it's so much easier. And yeah, maybe the OB truck's gone, but there's still a little caravan knocking around here.
Our next topic is actually going to be talking about remote broadcasting and almost when you think of IP now, you think about remote control. Marcus, you do a lot with mid small. Will you take care of this next question for us?
With what, sorry, Jay?
Can you see the next question? Can you take care of this for us?
Oh, let me quickly. Is this Vishals?
Yes.
He's from New Zealand. He can't read.
And you can't play rugby.
It's about soundproofing, guys. It's about people that are using non-perfect podcasts. Give them some advantages or some products that you guys recommend to give them some isolation without using the egg carton on the wall.
Well, look, hey, that still works. You can. It looks like hell, but it still works. So I think Mike was saying earlier, and this is a very important definition that we need to think about with acoustics, because acoustics is a multifaceted term, right? So it's not that hard to make a room space sound good to a microphone. It really isn't. So if you're in the middle of the countryside and there's no noise around at all, and you want to convert your bedroom into a really good sounding studio, you can. If you want to really cheap it out, jump on Alibaba or some of those Temu or whatever site you've got available to you, and do a search for acoustics. You'll find some really, really cheap stuff, bit of contact adhesive, this stuff on the wall, and you'll have a really dead good sounding studio. If a truck rolls by, you're probably done. But that's the difference with acoustics between acoustic treatment for reflections and so on and so forth, and sound isolation. It's sound isolation that really costs you your money. And so if you're really into serious, doing jingles and recording studio stuff, depending on the environment in which your studio's in, you're probably going to have to spend the coin.
because Marcus, you're probably not so good with the words, but over COVID, you would have seen a lot of pictures because, pictures tell 1,000 words and that whole Kiwi thing. You might have noticed a lot of people. Yeah, that's you, mate. We love this rivalry between us, Australians and New Zealanders. We love this. But I saw a lot of COVID people rocked up and then just got denied access to their offices. So said, we still have to broadcast. What are we going to do? And some of the most ingenious things I'd seen is off the back of that, people working from their wardrobes, just in amongst their suits and stuff like that. It depends on what you're doing, but if you've just got to chuck something quickly together, you can be really inventive into getting a space that will just work for you in that moment. I'm not sure if you guys have seen any of those quick little flip-ups that people have done during that time.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And that's true. Next question we have from Boyd Leader here. Boyd, I'm going to touch on this in a minute because it's going to be our last topic about visual radio. So we're going to get to this. But yeah, there's lots of cool things that we're doing, integrating switching and stuff into consoles or Blackmagic. So we'll touch on that in a moment. As Marcus said, when the earlier question was about OB broadcast, I think the pandemic threw us into making sure that everything was an OB broadcast now. That not only can we get remote commentators, content callers, Skypes, but also control the systems. During COVID, we were thrust into this, and everybody was sort of buying hardware codecs. When we ran out of hardware, we went to software codecs. We sold hundreds and hundreds of remote software that people didn't think they needed before. When they were talking about remote interfaces, they were like, oh, well, that's for the engineer. That makes his job easier. He doesn't have to come in and push a button or fix this or fix that. But after the pandemic, every single studio project that we work on, we take into that remote control considerably. And Mike, have you seen that in your designs and working with all the clients, the need to have, people work from home and also control all the different systems, phone systems, console systems, routing, and automation systems?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty absurd at this point to think of building a facility that I cannot remotely control the console. And there are still vendors that sell consoles that cannot be remotely controlled, and it's insane because I just cannot see recommending that to anyone at this point. As far as remote connectivity, I think that there's a few platforms that, again, especially once you move into AOIP, it becomes a lot easier to have this box that used to do 2 codecs now does 5, or that used to do 2 codecs in and out does 8 or whatever. So you can really kind of scale that up without having to add a lot of time at the install, which is convenient. So I think that ends up being something that's a little more focused on rather than just, we've got a remote at a bar. We have one Comnex access. So there's definitely more of a focus on that. It doesn't end up usually at this point because of other advances in terms of moving to AOIP and the platforms that provide those codecs. It doesn't really end up adding that much to the installation time. It adds to the cost to buy the gear in the first place because, of course, people make more money on it. But there's certainly more of a focus there and making sure that there's adequate machines to remote into, to control consoles, to automation we could remote into for, 10 years, 15 years. But having it set up and dedicated for if somebody needs to work remotely, how do they control automation? How do they make sure that they can route their own codec to air? How do they do those things? Those are all just kind of embedded in the thought of what that workflow is for those facilities.
As well, I would say between you guys, you take care of hundreds and hundreds of radio studios, if not 1,000. From a technical support standpoint, because all of you folks sell service, not only to install and get radio stations up and running, but you guys also offer SLAs and ongoing maintenance programs to help these broadcasters that may not have the technical ability, or in the case of New Zealand, or such a remote location, nobody can get to them. So how important is that for you folks? And I will start with Chris and work our way around. How important is that for you to choose equipment for clients that you can support remotely?
Absolutely. I don't think, like Mike said, I don't think there's really any choice anymore. I think with where you can't get engineers anymore and you need that help, it's a way you can pick up the phone and just do the things that you need to get done to get people back on the air. And you can remotely diagnose things and you're not just rocking up without any idea of what's going on if you have to turn up to site. I think there's a lot of good business reasons. And I think when there's convergence between what engineering have traditionally done on the traditional side, and now there's the IT, and they were always sort of separate, now with them being hand in hand, I think, yeah, we kind of expect that with the systems that you can do all these sort of remote control things and that there is no local support anymore. The businesses are used to that.
Yep. Marcus, same with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And to that extent, even it's the old adage, you don't know what you don't know. And even when clients, they invest in this new technology and they don't necessarily understand the benefits of how much easier it is to remote support. I mean, we have probably on our last 4 community access stations where there hasn't been budget, we've put in remote support PCs, just simply because it is so much easier when they're on the phone going, hey, my microphone's low in level, or the mic processing isn't exactly as I want it. Can you get some rumble from the air conditioner out? Rather than it being a service visit to a completely different city, it's quickly log in and make a couple of tweaks and you're done. And it really is, you just wouldn't want to be without that anymore.
Yep. Well, I will say this sort of gets us into the next topic with visual radio, because we did a massive project for the 10th largest billing radio station in America. And it's called the Sports Hub. It's in Boston. They recently relocated to a new building. Mike's team, Inrush, and this radio studio is a massive talk studio with multiple control rooms that is on television 8 hours a day. So that is the big extreme, but Mike and his team were on site doing all the installation, all the mic placements, everything. And then Chris's team was in Australia doing all the code and scripting for the system. And Chris had remote access. But that was an example where, yeah, you couldn't have done that. You were in Melbourne, Australia, and Mike and his team were in Boston. Yeah, pretty convenient.
So we couldn't get that. That worked really well. And it was beautiful to be able to do that remotely and work together on that project. Inrush did an amazing job on that. It was quite a privilege to work with the WBZ team and Inrush.
So one of the last things, we have a question here from Rajesh, and it's about what kind of new tech can you use to optimize new studio cost? Obviously an IP console routing system, something that doesn't take a lot of installation. Half the cost of an analog studio is the cost of the wiring blocks and the guy to do all that. Termination, I used to sell a console for $6,000 in a $3,000 wiring package. Now we sell like $300 worth of Studio Hub dongles. So I would say, pick an integrated system, sir, that communicates well with your automation system via IP with a single cable. Minimize your infrastructure and go with an IP system. And you guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Yep. So the last thing, and I'm going to hand this off to you, Chris, first, because I know everybody in Australia wants to be a TV star. And so,
for radio.
Yeah, so now what we're doing is visual radio.
That's just Chris. That's the home improvement beard. That's what that is.
Visual radio. How do you guys plan for visual? Chris, how do you plan for visual radio, and how important is it today in doing a new studio build?
I think it's a little bit. It's a fair bit about exposure and monetization. I think everyone's really used to those bite-sized reels and shorts that you can flick through. So I think the end game is for broadcasters getting those little bite-sized bits out there and getting that onto the platforms that people are on, all of the platforms, and then drawing them back to the main product. And then, the different outlets, whether it be streaming, video or audio, just audio, getting them onto the traditional FM or digital services. At the end of the day, most of these places are for the dollar. So, yeah, it's absolutely critical to get on video.
Yeah, and so I've seen like two ways to do the video or live, visual radio. In some of our major markets, people have a Blackmagic switcher. They have somebody in a separate video room switching cameras, doing a live show, a sports talk show, or a live breakfast show. In mid and small markets, we're seeing a lot of automation doing this, like Studio Cast or Multicam or HD Video Mixer. In your respective markets, Michael, do you see a lot of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the facility I'm working on now is going to be kind of a cross of that, in the sense that there are dedicated positions for someone to be able to actually mix that over the course of a show and adjust. But then at the same time, it's a Wheatstone build, and we're going to be integrating in tallies from the mic so that it can also be set to automatically transition between mics, or only use certain mics that have been turned on, adjust by audio level and so on, and do some auto switch. So some of that auto switching can be kind of integrated into for situations in which there is no one to actually produce it, as it happens. So it usually ends up being some combination of that. But yes, definitely something that's being built in kind of from the ground up.
And are you also taking in lighting considerations with some of this? I mean, you guys are all audio guys to begin with. Now, when you guys are building these studios, do you think about LED lights and stuff like that for visual radio? Should our customers be considering lighting as well as much as we do the audio?
That's a tough sell, because I think that the problem is that right now, I think a lot of it is, I don't want to say it's buzz, but it's a lot of like, right now, everybody's like, we have to have cameras, we have to have all of this stuff. And then it's like, okay, well, it'll cost you. And they're like, we just kind of want to do it cheap. So like, it's hard to, like, yeah, you should consider that. But also, if we really wanted to consider it, that all of it should really be for video, then why do we actually have mic booms? Why do we not just lob people like it's a TV studio? So it's this kind of like, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it still look like a radio studio with cameras and have camera shots that look like they're for TV, if that makes sense. So yes, we should consider lighting, but at the same time, we should be considering more than that if we want it to look like it's TV.
Marcus, what do you have to say down there about with your clientele?
Well, the visual radio thing, our clients here are at pains to point out that they don't want it to look like TV. They want it wants to be video of radio, but and we're not going to have time to dive into this, unfortunately. But one of the other areas that we could have gone into was how on earth do you create studios these days that is are really good for visual radio, but don't have the necessary clutter, the screens, the automation system, the mic booms, all the stuff that you actually need in front of you to make a radio product, but at the same time is the arch enemy of cameras. It's a pig of a thing to do. And even worse to actually get it to look good. But with all the screen branding and things that we've been talking about, some of the results are really quite spectacular. And in building studios, the consideration is hang some bits of 2-inch water pipe out of shot up above you, because then you can and some PowerPoints up there. Just stick some LED panels up when they actually decide that it's looking a little too gloomy.
Awesome, Chris. They're going to give us a little bit more time. Do you have anything you want to talk about regarding this?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with Marcus there. The best studios I've seen of late are some really smart people who've decided we're going to just line the walls with tube all around, and we're going to be able to mount cameras or lighting or even hang microphones if we have to make them multi-purpose rooms. And they can just move the stuff around as they move the talent around. And they've got video routers sitting behind their walls, so they can put branding on certain walls, and they can put return video feeds on opposing walls. And some of these spaces are really quite smart, and they're using very smart audio routing with digital audio routers, and some pretty decent video switching as well, which is reasonably cost effective now. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get a good result. I think in the radio for us, it's really about the sizzle bits. We can stream a whole show of 3 hours of the Brekkie show, but they'll probably only have 3 or 4 minutes of stuff you really want to see. And for that, we just multi-track down everything. So we multi-track down all the video to the multi-camera shots, the separate files, and we do that to the audio as well out of the Wheatie systems. And a lot of it's done in post-production. So we do have live content that goes out, but the majority of it you see is live content, post-production content, all polished to get people back to the main service.
And the reality is, if you look at a lot of these radio stations, the best of reels that they're doing now, there's no way they'd do it without video. Simply, you wouldn't see it. You wouldn't see the big major market breakfast shows ever publish social media updates on what happened this morning without video. Wouldn't happen.
I agree. We got another question here. And it's Rashish. Yes. Open studio. Is it feasible? Can one avoid the conventional studio today? Yes, there is. Newsrooms do it all the time. Talk studios, as Marcus was saying, with today's mic technology, we do the Dan Patrick studio that is actually in a basketball court. We make some really good mic processing. We've got good mic placement. We've got a good sound engineer. But yeah, it's definitely a possibility. WTOP is the #1 billing radio station in America. We have 50 news booths that are just in an open atrium, and they are doing that every single day. So yeah, if you get the right gear and the right space, you can do a broadcast from an open room.
I think you've got to embrace those things too. A really wise production person once said to me, it's theatre of the mind. Radio is really theatre of the mind. So when you're hearing it and you're at a venue, you want to hear it. You want to be part of that. You want to feel like you're immersed in it. So I think, if you're in a position that doesn't sound like a studio and you don't want it to be a studio, maybe it shouldn't sound like a studio.
Cool. Anybody else? Marcus, anything on that?
Well, it's kind of funny because that kind of round robins back to our talk about acoustics. You might have a radio station, a community radio station that is part of a town that is in a main street, and you don't care whether or not you hear people on the main street when the microphone's open.
I would honk every time I drove by that station.
you would do it whether there was soundproofing or
not. Yeah. Well, on that, Michael, do you have anything on these open air venues or anything, live performance studios that you see?
No, I mean, just kind of doubling down on what everybody else has already said that, it's sort of nice to kind of have that in the background. There's a station in Watseka, Illinois that they just moved from being they were out at the transfer site. They moved into the main street, air studios on the street. It's just single pane glass. You walk by, you hear it. But honestly, I think it kind of adds to the allure of this thing's really local. So I think that's great. And I think in terms of the open newsroom concept, it's something that gets done all the time. So if we're talking about open newsrooms, yes. I don't know if I think I'd put a morning show in an open studio without walls, but there's a lot of conditions in where you can have, lightly produced stuff that, I mean, especially for news, I think on some level, if you have some background chatter, it kind of adds to the sound of the news report on some level. And on top of it can be done without dealing with a lot of open noise anyways. So
awesome. Well, I want to thank all you guys today. For those viewers that may have not been able to see our entire session, it is going to be available on www.redtechpro. Marcus, if you want to see yourself, you can go back and look at that as well.
No, I'm going to spend time looking at you.
But I do, Michael, I want to thank you from Chicago, and Marcus and Chris, thank you guys for waking up and doing this. And thank you for all the viewers around the world to take time to watch this. And especially thank you to our sponsors at Red Tech for putting this radio week together. I hope everybody enjoys their programming. And from some of you, I'll see you next week at the Paris radio show in France. So everybody take care. Have a good morning, evening, and afternoon. Cheers.